Good evening. I am Carol Urich, and as president of the Wadsworth Athenaeum Docent Council, I welcome you all here tonight to our annual memorial lecture. For those in the audience, please remember to silence your cell phones. Welcome to all of you dialing in virtually. I'm sorry not to be with you in person in the theater, but this lecture is earlier in the year than usual, so work obligations have me out of town this evening. Since the inception of the Docent Council in 1968, docents have supported and honored each other. In that spirit, the idea was born to provide a way to meaningfully remember docents that we have lost, as well as loved ones lost to docents. This concept materialized into the annual Docent Council Memorial Lecture, which we're enjoying this evening. Docents donate to the Memorial Fund in honor of docents and loved ones lost throughout the year. This year, the following docents, family members, and friends have been honored with memorial donations made in their name. First, let's begin with the docents that we have lost from the docent corps. We love them while they were with us. We grieve them now that they've passed. They will always be remembered. Drone Traverso, Carol Cunning, and June Rosenblatt. Donations were also made in memory of loved ones lost by docents. This year they are Chris Harry Christopher, my dearly beloved brother-in-law, and Maureen Ferrenti, a lifelong friend. Let's pause for a moment in silence in their honor. Our Memorial Fund enables the Docent Council to offer lectures that bring prominent artists and scholars to the museum. We enjoy inviting the public to join us for these special lectures, as we did this evening. So this year is no exception. We are thrilled for this evening's lecture as we open up our new Milton Avery exhibition. The Docent Council is delighted to be sponsoring this evening's event. And so it is with great pleasure that I ask Denise Giannino, Docent and Tour Programs Manager, to introduce our guest speaker for the evening. Please enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Carol Urich, for that virtual introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, both here in the museum and virtually at home. I'm Denise Giannino, the Docent and Tour Program Manager at the Wadsworth. It's terrific to see so many faces here in person tonight. And we are broadcasting the lecture live over Zoom, and we have over 400 people watching at home. It's a little bit overwhelming to think of so many people near and far gathering to learn and celebrate Connecticut artist Milton Avery, whose roots are right here in Hartford. We hope you had the chance to explore the exhibition in depth and participate in programs throughout the coming months. Tonight, we're celebrating the first large-scale survey of Milton Avery in 3 decades. This significant show explores the evolution of a preeminent modern painter who forged a staunchly independent path as an artist to become one of the greatest colorists of the 20th century. The exhibition was organized by the Royal Academy of Arts, London, in collaboration with the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth and the Wadsworth Athenaeum Museum of Art, and will travel to the Royal Academy for its final leg of the tour. Support for this exhibition is generously provided by the Milton and Sally Avery Arts Foundation, the Saunders Foundation, and the estate of James Lyon. Sustaining support for the Wadsworth Athenaeum is provided by the Greater Hartford Arts Council and the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development. A special thank you goes to our speaker tonight, the exhibition's organizing curator, Edith Devaney. Excuse me. Edith's extraordinary vision and tireless efforts helped to ensure the exhibition came together despite the challenging circumstances of the past 2 years. Erin Monroe, our Kriebel Curator of American Paintings and Sculpture, served as the in-house curator. Their collaboration has been outstanding and has brought about a tremendous result. I'd like to also thank the Docent Council for their generosity in sponsoring this major lecture. Their dedication to the educational mission of the museum is evident in their support to bring esteemed speakers to the museum and through their tremendous efforts at delivering engaging and enriching tours for our audiences. We are recording this lecture, so please take a moment to silence any electronic devices that make noise. And now tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Edith Devaney, formerly the Modern and Contemporary Curator at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and currently the Managing Director and Curator for David Hockney Inc. and the David Hockney Foundation. Edith Devaney is an expert on modern and contemporary art and presents many renowned American painters in a new light, or offers a fresh perspective on many noted American painters, as you will see tonight. Prior to working with David Hockney in Los Angeles, she curated exhibitions for the Royal Academy of Arts for 22 years, including David Hockney, A Bigger Picture in 2012, Abstract Expressionism in 2016, and Jasper Johns, Something Resembling Truth in 2017. She curated the Royal Academy's summer exhibition for 20 years and has published extensively. This evening, Devaney will present on the trajectory of Avery's career and his place in modern American art. Please join me in welcoming Edith Devaney.
Thank you, Denise, for the introduction. And it is wonderful to be here. It's such a joyous thing to open any exhibition, but to open an exhibition of Milton Avery's work here in Hartford, where he spent his formative years, is just a particularly glorious occasion. I just wanted to start by putting up a self-portrait of Milton Avery, and he painted himself very regularly throughout his life, and he never flattered himself. I think his self-portraits are particularly wonderful, particularly illuminating. But I just wanted to introduce a concept that I'm going to kind of return to throughout the lecture. And that's really kind of looking at his debt to other painters and how he's taking inspiration from very wide sources. And this particular work reminds me very much of the way that Pierre Bonnard, the French painter, tackled interiors, where you have a figure in one space and there's another space that's located behind it. So you're almost kind of cutting the canvas in two. And Avery does this in a really kind of interesting way. But as is typical of so much of his work, there is that element of humor as well. With the bathroom scene, you can see the comb by just sitting behind the tap, and probably the shaving brush up in the corner as well. But it is it's a really interesting way of in which he composes work. It's a great honor to be here, as I said, and it's just a wonderful experience to open any exhibition given the recent pandemic. And as Denise said, I can't say that it's been easy. I think every institution, I know that curators here, Erin, everyone else here will know how difficult it has been over the past year with exhibitions cancelled and changed and a constant churn of amendments and withdrawals. So I want to thank all of our partners, the Wadsworth and the team here, the executive team, the curators, and also the Modern for their tenacity and belief in this project to keep everything on track and keep everything going. And with every exhibition, it's not just the curators and the touring partners that make it. It's all of the other people who add to that collective effort. And we have very generous lenders, as I said in my opening remarks on Tuesday night. Nobody wants to let go of the Milton Averys, and why should they? They're such wonderful, joyful paintings. So it's particularly wonderful, and we're particularly grateful to lenders who've allowed us to show them in not just one, but 3 different venues. As has already been said, the Milton Avery Trust have been unbelievably supportive, and to have the opportunity to go to the foundation and have access to all of their works and talk to Avery's daughter, Marge, has just been an unbelievable privilege. And I hope that that experience is somehow shown in how the exhibition is put together. Sean and Wakas Wajahat, and another important element within the Milton Avery story and the Milton Avery Trust. They gave me so much time to go through all of the racks, to look at all of the work, and help to persuade private collectors to part with these works. So it has really been a team effort. And as a result, this exhibition has emerged pretty much unscathed from COVID in terms of everything we wanted to do, its reach and its ambition and its focus. And in thinking about what I wanted to say in this talk and what I wanted to cover and what information I should pass on to visitors to the exhibition to enhance their understanding of the exhibition's premise, I was struck once again by the complexity of looking at Avery, both as an artist and also considering his place within the canon of modern American art. For while the accessibility of his work with its non-dependence on academic interpretation are hallmarks of his style, the development of his art and the place he occupies in modern art are much more challenging to unravel. As with his work, what looks and indeed is harmonious on the surface belies a greater complexity at its core. What I'm really trying to say is that Avery's works, and I know that all of you have just been to see them in the galleries, and I hope that you enjoyed it and will come back many times. But, you know, Avery's works are appealing because they seem to be simple. And I say that in the best meaning of the word, but I don't think he is. And I don't think the works are simple. Each work has been put together with such a careful distillation of a lifetime of observation and understanding, and that is coupled with his formidable drive and work ethic. I say all of this in part to give an excuse to the wide-ranging number of subjects and directions which I'll be covering in this talk, where I'll be looking at Avery's development and his location in the trajectory of American modernism, as well as his legacy. I'll also be referencing at times the particular thesis which lies behind the curation of this exhibition of his work and his enduring influence. So I thought it was helpful, or maybe I'm just being slightly self-indulgent, to describe my own route into Avery's work, which led to the instigation of this exhibition. And in some part, it's not just being self-indulgent, because I think in some part it is quite informative of his past and ongoing status. And anyone who has the merest knowledge of American art is familiar with Milton Avery and his work. And I have long been aware of him, and I'm not sure if it's known particularly in America that there are very few Milton Averys in Europe, and I have never seen one in a public collection in Europe, and there's never been an exhibition of his work. But I was aware of him, and I had seen a few examples of his work firsthand. And in my regular contact with contemporary artists, as Denise said, I ran the summer exhibition, which is a contemporary art show for over 20 years. And in my regular contact with artists, I was conscious that so many of them cited him as a major inspiration because they saw in his work this very, very unique approach to color in his compositions. Artists such as the young British artist Gary Hume, who's not so young now, he's 60, and the artist Peter Doig are key examples of this. And I learned a lot talking to them. They kind of deciphered for me their particular artist's route into Avery's work and how they saw him from an artist's perspective. Because the late art historian Dory Ashton very accurately noted that Avery is a painter's painter. And indeed, his art was and continues to be held in very high esteem by other painters. So this slide is of Woman Ironing, and it dates from 1945. And I actually saw this work. I was in America trying to secure works for a Diebenkorn exhibition that I was working on. And I came across this by surprise when I was in the Cantor collection in Stanford University. And it was sitting in a gallery with other very significant, great American works of the 20th century. And to me, it just looked like a jewel. And was such a kind of, appealing, attractive work. And it's very typical of Avery's paintings for this time, with the everyday subject treated in the most effective way by use of color. But it's also, to go back to this idea of influences, it's very reminiscent of so many of the European modernist painters. And one of the things that I noted about it, and I think compositionally it's very interesting, is this dynamic diagonal, which it's a little bit like Felix Vallotton. It's a bit like Degas when you think about his pictures of ballet, where you've got that diagonal floor in the ballet studio crossing. And it's a very interesting composition. And he also contrasts that dark floor with that beautiful blue walls, and he's scratching onto the surface. And you see it in some of the paintings upstairs as well. He's scratching onto the surface of the paint, the detail of the door. So it's very, very minimal detail. But what's also remarkable is the relationship between the woman and the ironing board. I mean, it's the most domestic of subjects, but he creates this wonderful kind of sense of harmony because of the due to the complementary colors, which range from pink through to orange hues and reds. So he's really unifying the figure and the object. And I think this is kind of breakthrough. It was executed in 1945, which is the point where Avery really did make that huge leap into this other way of working. And of course, I will refer to that a little bit later in this lecture. But my second and very meaningful focus on Avery's work was through abstract expressionism. And when I was working on the big exhibition I did for the Royal Academy, I was conscious of how often Milton Avery's name came up in all of the research that I was doing, particularly when you think about those color field painters. And I realized that he was much closer to the emergence of abstract expressionism than I had originally appreciated. And it made me want to interrogate his work more and to really kind of examine his contribution to post-war American art in more detail. And it led to working on this exhibition. And it led to my introduction to the Milton Avery Foundation and his daughter and grandson. And that was the starting point where all of this then gathered pace. So also in this lecture, I want to consider his development as an artist and the techniques that he employed to achieve his unique composition. So I will touch on that throughout. And the extent to which, I've already talked about Matisse, I've talked about Degas, I've talked about Vallotton, and it really is that those connections that he makes to European modernism, which are kind of, were running against the tide at the time. So this is a wonderful early picture of Milton Avery working in Gloucester. And his route towards being an artist is rather an unorthodox one. He as was said, his formative years were spent here in Hertford. And he was born in 1885. He was part of a very working class family. His father supported the family by working as a tanner, and Avery left school without graduating and started working in a factory at the age of 16. So his education was very limited. And in 1905, when he was working in a factory, he enrolled in a course of commercial lettering at the Connecticut League of Art Students. And this was very much an attempt to further his earning prospects and potential, which was possibly prompted by the death of his father, which meant that Avery, this very young man from a working class family, was really the main supporter of the financial support for the family. So it really placed pressure on him. And that was thought to be the reason that he enrolled in this lettering course. But he was encouraged then by the League's art teacher to transfer to a drawing class, which happened a month after the lettering class started and then closed. And he did. And that was the beginning of Milton Avery as an artist. And he continued to attend art evening classes and related discussions until 1918, when he then transferred to the School of the Art Society in Hartford. The training that he received there was across both organizations, in fact, was traditional and academic. He was taught by very accomplished artists who were pretty well known in their own right. But at the same time, it was part-time and somewhat informal. But it was there that Avery received his artistic instruction for 15 years, which is a very, very long apprenticeship. But the course didn't result in a recognized qualification. And there have been commentators in the past who, because of this, have suggested that, and I think unfairly, that Avery was essentially self-taught. And I don't think that's the case at all. But I think what he did learn, possibly as a result of the part-time situation and the need for self-motivation, because there wasn't a kind of formal structure or exam system, that he became very self-motivated, and that his autodidactic propensity was really honed in these years of attending classes. And it continued unabated throughout the rest of his career. He was continually wanting to develop, to push himself, to learn new ways of depicting the world. And he always strove to develop his work and was very confident from his early years as an artist to experiment. And that's something that we see throughout the exhibition. And then when he later goes to New York and he's maturer and he's showing work, he still attended drawing classes for many years at the Art Student League there. And the reason for this self-imposed, very lengthy training is unknown. We know from correspondence that he felt sufficiently proficient and committed to describe his occupation as an artist by as early as 1911. So suggests he had no doubt about his ability. This would also have been confirmed by the approbation, albeit in a somewhat modest scale, which followed in 1915 when he started to exhibit locally. And his work from this period is very accomplished, although traditional. It reflects the influence of his teachers and their allegiance to American Impressionism. And indeed, American Impressionism exerted a very strong influence in all of the Avery's contemporaries who were painting with him in Hartford at that time. And I've got a slide here of one of those American Impressionists, John Henry Twatchman, which was painted in 1900, featured Squam. And the depiction of the natural world seen in American Impressionist painting, and indeed of Ernest Lawson's painting as well. They held a lot of appeal to Avery, and it was in particular their focus on the landscape and painting directly from the motif. So they would go out with their paints and their canvas, and they would paint looking at the landscape. So it really was this attempt to capture the reality of the scene they were sitting in, but also capture that sense of the unique atmosphere that each subject brought. And the lessons that Avery, so this is Lawson approaching storm. And you can see both in Lawson and Twatchman, they're very, very dense, very worked canvases, relatively small, a real sense of perspective. So the lessons that Avery learned from the American Impressionist during his long artistic training very much laid the foundations to his approach throughout his career. He assumed into his own practice as a fundamental principle their regard for painting directly from the motif on plein air. He espoused the importance of verisimilitude and of fidelity to the evocation of this sense of place. And from his earliest landscapes executed in Connecticut, Avery demonstrated his engagement with the natural world at first hand. Working on a small portable scale, these accomplished landscapes dating from 1918 show his burgeoning grasp of composition. And they also reveal his instinctive sensibility to color and an early understanding of the importance of the effects of light. So this is one of the Avery works that you would have seen upstairs. And incidentally, these works dating from the early 1900s have never been seen before. So this really is the first opportunity that anyone has had to see them. And we all felt it was very important to include these in the exhibition. And you can see in this composition, and it's very small, as you know, and it intimates elements of Lawson's technique. And here Avery is using a palette knife to apply the paint, where he's blending it onto the canvas with his finger to create this very, very smooth surface in each of the impasto paint marks is kind of smooth to this reflective surface. So then they collectively contribute to that sense of variegated light that plays across the uneven canvas. And it's that sense of light that kind of works in concert with the color. So it's the two things together. So he was really kind of pushing that and experimenting with it very successfully. I mean, I think these works are, they have a great maturity to them. And when you look at, how well he's reflecting in the water and how well he's kind of, it's placing his competition. It's very, very sure-footed for an artist that is not yet wholly professional. But his instinct of color, which you can very much see here, was recognized by others even at this early stage in his career. He began receiving his first mentions in group exhibitions in the 1920s, and one of his earliest advocates was Henry McBride, who worked for the New York Sun. And he was to remain a steadfast supporter of Avery's developing work over the course of many years. And reviewing a group exhibition in New York in January 1929, McBride singled out Milton Avery as a new and promising painter. He wrote, his canvases are somber in tone, but the color is rich, and the man has a genuine instinct for painting. And I think it's important for me to mention here that Avery was focusing on the landscape and later portraiture at the same time that the American realist painters and regionalism was very much at its height. And these movements included artists like Grant Wood, of course, American Gothic, and Thomas Hart Benton, who was the teacher of Jackson Pollock. And Jackson Pollock said he was always pushing this, realism at us. But they were working figuratively, as was Avery, of course. But their approach to figuration was absolutely wildly different to Avery's, because Avery completely eschewed any socio-political subject matter. And in his early and mid-career subjects, he represented everyday life. So he was taking so much from European modernism, from Matisse and other artists of that era. And where the deliberate ordinariness of the subject served to highlight the work's composition. And this rendered his vision a much more universal one, as opposed to the native concerns of the realists and the regionalists. For unlike the work of his contemporaries, and to an extent, this was repeated again with the younger abstract expressionist work, Avery's paintings did not emerge from the concerns which were radically changing American life at that time. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and resultant economic devastation of the Second World War, the nuclear bomb, and the Cold War. His singularity of vision enabled him to retain his inherent focus on the harmony of his paintings, a perfect balance between composition and subject. And this is not to suggest that Avery was indifferent or insensible to the momentous changes and uncertainties taking place around him, but any emotion engendered in his work was, as he put it himself, the emotion aroused in me by the impact with the original idea. And this understanding of what was essentially expressionism was not lost on the younger abstract expressionists, who developed this notion still further, with the emotional element effectively becoming the painting subject. Mark Roth, human emotions. So Avery moved from Hartford to New York with his wife in 1925 at a time of great cultural and societal change. And the darkening of his palette, which you can see here in this painting, City from 1928, very much reflects some of these somber times. But his arrival in the city also coincided with the beginning of what was to be the most creative periods of regeneration in America's cultural history. And starting in 1929 with the opening of MoMA under the direction of the visionary Alfred Barr. Then the Whitney Museum of Art followed in 3 years after the opening of MoMA. And by the 1930s, many influential artists and intellectuals were fleeing the rise of Nazism in Europe and had settled in New York. Artists like Joseph Albers and later Hans Hofmann resumed their teaching practices in America and exported many European practices and ideas to the United States. And then by the 1940s, Marcel Duchamp, André Breton, Max Ernst, and Roberta Matta, amongst many others, had arrived, and they made an inevitable impact on New York's artistic community and brought with them a deeper understanding of the recent major European artistic movements of Surrealism and Cubism, which, of course, both of these movements were critical to the development of abstract expressionism. But as Avery had done in the country, in New York, he turned his gaze towards his surroundings. And although compositionally interesting and reflecting some of the design elements that had appeared in his recent landscapes, New York clearly was not, nor never really would be, an enduring subject for him. City is a good example of his urban compositions, and he's conveying the compression and the gloom of the city on the brink of the Great Depression. And in this work, you can see that he's already beginning to do that thing that he started in the late 1920s, carried on in the 30s, to distort form and perspective. And he's starting also to apply his paint a little bit more thinly and without texture. And you can see here, it's almost as if he's looking through a fisheye lens, but it's that kind of absolute compression of the city, which I think is really remarkable here. This is such a wonderful work, Chariot Race. And again, it's hardly been seen, so it's really exciting to have it here in the exhibition, dating from 1933. And Avery gravitated towards events and gatherings in the city, which showed people enjoying themselves, activities which took them away from everyday life experience. And this very ambitious Chariot Race is one such example and is executed with a great deal of bravado and easy humor. And Avery has got this ability to inject this sense of humor so deftly into his works. I mean, it's such a light touch. I think he does it brilliantly. And this is the largest early work that he did. And he didn't really work on this scale again until he went to Provincetown in the 1950s. And again, those larger paintings you see at the exhibition here. Now, we know from documentation, from interviews with Sally Avery, his wife, we know from talking to Marge that the Averys were serious and dedicated visitors to museums and galleries. And they used to devote every single Saturday to putting down their paintbrushes and going out and seeing everything. So from that information, I have surmised that he saw absolutely everything that was happening in New York. And one of the things that I became completely obsessed by was when I was doing the research for the exhibition, was to try and track exhibitions that he must have seen and their dates and what works were shown and how it affected his work. And it was the most illuminating and fun exercise. And one of the works I was sort of delighted to find that he must have seen was this work of the Circus by Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. It's a wonderful painting, and I'm absolutely sure that he must have seen this. And the subject and the frenzy of whirling activity, and again that sense of slight distortion of the composition, they do bear some resemblance to Avery's work. And the dates match up. This would have been shown in MoMA, and I have to think that he saw it. I'm sure he did, but I just think it's a really interesting comparison. But he also sought out local scenes away from the built environment and closer to the natural world, where he felt much more comfortable. And Coney Island was an opportunity to combine human activity with the landscape. And that was a practice he began in the early 1930s. And he made regular and increasingly successful features of this in his work for the rest of his career. And here in Coney Island, he's depicting a seething mass of day trippers and captures this kind of collective feeling of abandon. You know, people are really having a rest from the working week. But he does some really interesting things in it. You can see in these figures on the foreground, they're foreshortened. So he's giving that kind of sense of them. By backdropping them against this seething mass, he's creating this sense of perspective. But the crowd of people also obscures the landscape. So in the end, it's only the attire of all of the subjects and the title of the work that gives you an indication as to where it is, because the beach and the sea have all but been removed to leave room for the people. But it's a really remarkable work from 1931. And just to show the extent to which he was developing, this was done in the same year, same subject, Seaside. And it's a very strong exemplar of his experimentation, which he frequently approached in his work. And here the shoreline replaces the horizon. The rendering of the landscape is much more of a construct, the paring back of detail and near abstraction of much of the form, as well as the muted hues. And these are all things that are prescient of the sparse landscapes he was to paint later in Provincetown in the 50s and 60s. And throughout the first half of his career, there's very many instances, and this painting is certainly one of them, where Avery almost kind of gets ahead of himself, you know, momentarily, and often in a single work, you have that sense of him leaping forward and anticipating where his future direction is going to lead him. When talking about Avery as an artist, I mean, he must be one of the most difficult people to write a biography on. There are books on him, but he was very reticent to talk, and he was a man of few words, and he didn't often talk about his work. And one of his favorite phrases was, "Why talk when you can paint?" which I think gives us a kind of indication that he communicated to a great extent through his work. And that remark is quoted by so many people. So he's left very, very scant verbal or written matter. So it's what it makes it difficult to do is to chart his psychological or intellectual development alongside that of his paintings. But, you know, if we do accept that the paintings are talking to us, it's a narrative that we can devise ourselves. But I think that one of the things that I've tried to argue in my essay, and I think in the exhibition as well, is that he didn't shy away from others who approached art from a very different perspective, and nor did he shy away from those who are of a much more apparently intellectual inclination. And, you know, we know that he didn't have a long education. But that didn't seem to deter him at all. And the artist and poet David Burlick was one of Avery's more cerebral friends, and he had been a close associate of Vasily Kandinsky and was described as the father of Russian futurism. And one can only imagine the sort of intellectual conversations about paintings that they must have had. And Avery painted Burlick several times. And here he is as the principal figure in this wonderful painting from MoMA in New York called The Desert. And it's just such an extraordinary compositional piece, which is taken from a very interesting angle. I love these heads at the side. Just these profiles, but also I think this might be Burlick's wife. And there are a few from this period where he's given them green faces, but it's just, you know, the angle of the neck is something that he repeats again slightly later, but it's just the most wonderful, wonderful work. And John D. Graham, another Russian emigre who wrote Systems and Dialectics in Art. He was an artist, also a writer, and was a long and close long-term friend of and supporter of Avery's work. And he was really one of the most celebrated cultural figures in New York in the 1930s and 40s. Graham maintained close connections to Europe, which must have been of interest to Avery and the art scene there. He was also a mentor to Arshil Gorky, to Willem de Kooning, to David Smith. He introduced all of them to very differing artistic currents in Europe and beyond. So for me, it's of great interest that Avery had these strong friendships, and he even befriended Marcel Duchamp, teaching him how to play pool, which Duchamp was completely delighted with, apparently. So that was during a summer they spent together at MacDowell, which was an artist colony in Peterborough, New Hampshire, in 1954. And then, of course, the next generation, his protégés, Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman in particular, who were of the kind of strongest intellectual inclination out of the abstract expressionists. They really valued their time with Avery and their discussions with Avery about the practice and the theory of art. So we can surmise from that Avery must have displayed a very open and intelligent engagement with very many different ideas and perspectives. And I think, as I'm describing, he's fully embraced the artistic scene in New York, and he and Sally were known as very welcoming hosts. And although no one had very much money then, I hear that they used to have tea and crackers rather than what we would have now, a glass of wine, something nice to eat. But they welcomed everyone to their house, and younger artists like Rothko and Adolf Gottlieb as well would visit, often daily, because they knew that Avery was almost producing a painting a day and they wanted to see what he'd done. And they had first met in 1928, Rothko and Avery, through the Opportunity Gallery, where they first showed work together. And through Rothko, Avery befriended some of the other abstract expressionist artists, who of course weren't called that yet. That phrase, title wasn't coined until the 1940s. But all three of those artists, Newman, Rothko, and Gottlieb, all readily acknowledged Avery's influence in their work. They were very, very happy to talk about it. There's some wonderful quotes from them about how he introduced them to a different way of capturing the world. So this is a lovely photo of Avery and Sally, who was also an artist. And incidentally, Sally was determined when she married Avery, she was much younger than him, that she was going to support him as an artist. They lived very, very frugally, but she would not allow him to go out to work. She wanted him to devote all his time to painting. So she took on work for a magazine. And she did designs for a magazine, which paid for the family to live. So she was a huge supporter of his, and that support continued after his death. But Avery never wavered from his reliance on his own vision. And nowhere is that more evident than in the landscapes and seascapes. And his move to New York, I've already said that New York really wasn't the subject that was close to his heart. That it heralded a new way of working for him. So he established with Sally this routine where they would relocate with their family, with a daughter, every summer for a few months to an area of natural beauty. And often they were joined by Rothko and Gottlieb, who'd come along and work with them, and he would draw there and paint in watercolor and paper directly from the subject, as he had in his early days of training in Hartford. And these watercolors would then be developed or translated into oil paintings when he was back in his New York studio. So throughout the year, he would use those works that he had done on paper to create oil paintings. And despite working at some remove, I mean, sometimes it would be 2 years before he would get to the subject. He had this wonderful ability, which again I think comes from his training, and so much of it was innate as well, that he was able to conjure up that atmosphere of the place that he was describing. And each place, because he went to different venues, each place he visited would give rise to kind of subtle changes in his palette and composition, as well as contributing to the overall development of his work. He often revisited the same spots. Gloucester was one of his earliest and most regular haunts, but also he went to Vermont, the Gaspe Peninsula, many other places that inspired him. And the works developed from each setting just reveal that kind of very different ambience that he experienced. And I want to show a couple more slides of early landscapes, just to, again, like the Coney Island, show how quickly he was developing. This is another example of, this was done in the 1930s, so it's pretty early, but it's another example of Avery anticipating his future direction. It's very, very pared back. There's a kind of sparseness to it, but it doesn't feel empty. And then 1939 is Gaspe Village, where he's moved on a bit. He's flattening the composition. He's employing patterning when you see that in the on the sea and beyond. And he's also blending color in a different way. And I spoke in the introduction about this moment where he had a breakthrough in the 1940s, and it was Hans Hofmann, the German teacher who taught many of the second generation of abstract expressionists, who really talked about Avery just making such an incredible contribution to the development of American art. And it was 1944 when his career took a significant step forward. The previous year, he'd signed up to the prestigious gallery of Paul Rosenberg and Company, which was founded in France, but it opened in New York, and it represented many of the French modernist painters that Avery was really influenced by, like Matisse, Picasso, and Braque. And of course, being part of that gallery, he was able to look at those works. Those works were in the vaults. He could see those works next to him, so that his work. So that must have been such an informative experience. But he also had his first one-man show that same year at the Phillips Memorial Gallery in Washington, D.C. And this amusing portrait shows, I think, he's still got the red ears that you saw in the first one, but it shows a kind of confidence of Avery, because this was a real moment for him. And he's got these annotations about the galleries that represented him. And he was represented by several galleries at this time. Valentine Galleries here. And then the other two. It's a wonderful work with this huge overcoat. And again, kind of very, very distorted. And his keen interest in colour, already evident in the 1930s, evolved even further at this stage. So he began to lighten and flatten and layer his pigments onto the canvas, creating this luminosity across closely related planes of differing tone, with each colour modulated to complement the adjacent hues rather than provide contrast. And this, along with a simultaneous simplification in the form, replaced the traditional perspective in his work with a much more subtle intimation of depth and atmosphere. And all of that was dependent on how he used color. And this is exemplified in a 1944 painting, Two Figures at a Desk, which you would have seen upstairs. And again, there's lovely quirky things about this painting as well. You can see in the top, there's a bottom of a painting where he's signed. So he's put his signature in the bottom of that painting. But I love that there's something wonderful about this figure in the middle with the very dark hair and the contrast with the white. It's just the kind of core of the work. It's so pared back. This angle of the head, a little bit similar to the head of Berlich's wife in The Desert, a very, very strange angle. But the figure, and I think it must be March because of the extraordinary shape of her face, it's that Egyptian style. That's another thing that he took, and that kind of looks towards a kind of lack of perspective as well. And as everything. With every other painting, I'm kind of looking for things that might have influenced him. And of course, one of the major influences in his work was the work of Henri Matisse. And at times, Avery was talked about as the American answer to Matisse, which I think is unfair, because I think that he took elements from Matisse, but he never copied him. It was more referencing him. But this is a work that I saw relatively recently. I know that the piano replaces the table in the Avery work, but it's still that same kind of very pared down profile that's there with the decoration. And again, Avery was really experimenting with composition the way that Matisse did. And then this is one of my favorite paintings, which again is March, who's got, as I said before, she has this beautiful, very, very angular face. And like some of Matisse's work, Picasso as well, the features are very, very lightly drawn, no extraneous detail, very, very beautiful. But also the form here is, the form of the body is so reduced. And the dependence of color, you can see the green background, slightly darker green coming around her neck, and the detail of the hair. It's a really, really wonderful work. And as well as looking at works that influenced him, as I stated at the beginning, he's very much an artist, and I found my way to Avery to a certain extent through contemporary art, and someone like Barclay Hendricks, this wonderful portrait of Sir Nelson Solid from 1970. It's we know that Hendricks was exposed to Avery's work here at the Wadsworth Athenaeum during his time at Yale, and elements of Avery's mature style certainly found expression in his work here. And it's the block of background color. You've got this dense blue, the dense green, pretty much like March's top half, and that two zones of color just bring this greater focus to the face. And that's the idea of headgear is similar to March's babushka, but I just love that focus on the face. But I think this is such a kind of interesting reference to Avery. And then March in Brown. This again is March, and this tangle of limbs that you see is wonderful. But you've got that real sense of her form. But also you can see that the colors are so close to each other. So all of those browns are so complementary that it becomes an incredibly harmonious painting. The same happens in poetry reading. And this is where I say that, these works appear simple, but they're not. They're so carefully constructed. And all of these hues really close to each other. But then there's little accents, like, that very, very light blue of the little round table, and introducing a different shape, this corner of the wall running down. None of it is accidental. I think that's one of the reasons that we're drawn to his work, because it's just, it has that harmony that Rothko talked about. He talked about him being a poet in paint, and I think you see it very much here. Gary Hume, this is a work from 2008 called American Tan, a series of works that Gary Hume did. And Gary is passionate about Milton Avery, and of course it's his use of color, and it's these blocks of color, these close hues that are, when you think about March in Brown and you think about this, there are real similarities there. And Avery's breakthrough was not limited to interiors with figures. He also had the ability to mix his genres in a very original way. It's another thing I find really interesting about his work. So he's looking at the natural world. He's, this wonderful image of an oyster catcher. And it bears really close examination when you're standing in front of the painting, because he actually does work up the paint in this very well. And I love the way that the bird is kind of stretched from beak to foot. The foot is almost off the edge of the canvas. It's really kind of stretching across. But the landscape behind it seems very benign. He's part of the landscape, but he's not. It's a very, very interesting relationship between the two. And then another example of mixing genres is Hors d'oeuvre, which I think is just a kind of crazy, wonderful painting, which is very, very humorous. This elaborate plate, and the angle is interesting. The way you're looking down in it, which is kind of very Cézanne-like, looking down onto this plate, and yet there's the landscape behind. Very, very humorous work. And then another example of this is how he is able to place figures in the landscape, but they're not portraits. By the end of the 1940s, he'd stopped doing formal portraits, but he was still using the figure a lot in his work. But the figure became a device. It was just part of the work. And there's a mountain, there's a figure. It didn't really matter who it was. And here he's this is from the Metropolitan Museum. He is able to treat both genres in the same way and therefore fuses them together. And again, this is an example of humor with the swimmer doing backstroke in the water while the two women look on. But, the shapes and colors of their towels that they're sitting on echo the other side, the bank. And Peter Doig. So what you see here is kind of very, very similar scene, very similar treatment. Peter is using very translucent paint, but he's also picking up an Avery's earlier device to use non-associative colors. So we've got this blue figure and the reflection on the water, but these bands going across the horizon and the shore edge. And Reclining Nude is another wonderful work. And I feel here, this is so interesting that he's almost replicating the sense of the landscape in the curves of the woman, the way he's depicted that against the black background. But again, it's just, he is taking almost everything away, but you still know exactly what it is. So this is a later work, Black Sea from 1959 from the Phillips collection. And Avery's breakthrough in the 1940s established him as a leading figure and a celebrated American colorist, and one who significantly influenced the next generation of American painters who understood through him the possibility of employing color to create a sense of the sublime. And much of the work of Rothko and Newman was really predicated on this notion. These late works were executed in Cape Cod, where Avery summered for 4 consecutive years towards the end of his life, and he was often in the company of Rothko and Gottlieb. And they show him capturing nature in a way that he'd always done. He was out there, he was in it, he was describing his relationship with it. And he observed it faithfully, just in the way he'd done in his early work from his Hartford days, but he's paring away the detail even more. And in doing so, he's really challenging certain aspects of representation. But like Matisse, we must remember that Matisse sort of pushed right against those boundaries of abstraction. But Avery was just like Matisse, that he'd no intention of stepping over that threshold. He stayed within he stayed on the side of representation. I mean, he was always open to new ideas and ways of thinking. And these late canvases with their larger scale and more abstracted forms, they do reveal some of the influence of the younger abstract expressionists. Avery was always open to new ideas and new influences, and he was taking from his younger friends. There's certainly the larger canvas and certainly the kind of, reducing the number of colors. But one of the things that he never did was to invent what his eye didn't witness. And what's what's notable about some of those late works is it's only the title that tells us that they're not abstract works. By the title, he's giving us the narrative, and that changes our sense of how to approach the work. And what's notable, actually, and Rothko was one of the abstract expressionists that did this. Pollock was another one, and Clifford Still. They numbered their work because they didn't want any association with it. So they wanted the visitor to come to it with a completely unfiltered instruction as to how to view it. One of the key American art critics at the time, Clement Greenberg, described these late paintings as a magnificent flowering. And although Avery was moving closer to the borderline between representation and abstraction, he was really capturing what was the essence of nature. That's what he felt very strongly in these works. This is from the Met, Speedboat's Wake, another, I think, just beautiful, beautiful work. And then Beach Blankets. Again, the title is the only thing that really tells us that what this is. Otherwise, we would read it completely differently. And again, I found a link. These shapes in this Munch painting, I just thought that was so interesting. It just reminded me so much of Avery's work. June bushes. You can't do justice to this work by a slide because it really is completely luminous. He was working in kind of multi-layered veils of color, just building up this wonderful tone that really captured the extraordinary light in Provincetown. And it reflects the light. And it, of course, in those early works that we saw with the palette knife, that he worked with the palette knife, that was one of his earliest concerns, but he's achieving it here in these glazes of color instead. And this last work is Avery's final painting from 1964. And he was really quite infirm by this stage as a result of 2 heart attacks, but he must have summoned up all of his energy to complete this work. And just to make my point that I said earlier, I put this together with a slide of the work from the early 30s. You can see how much he's developed, but you can also see how much in the 1930s he was anticipating the direction he was headed in. It's a fascinating comparison. So in conclusion, does this exhibition, does a contemporary reading of Avery's work help us get closer to reappraising or confirming his position in the art canon? We know that Avery's work spanned and to some extent became the link between 2 significant movements in the United States in the 20th century, American Impressionism and Abstract Expressionism, with both having an impact in his oeuvre. Through his close association with younger key members of Abstract Expressionism, Avery's work played an influential role as to how that most American of artistic movements developed and unfolded. What is clear is that Avery was and continues to be a bridge between many artistic tendencies. As suggested earlier, he effectively bridged the gap between American Impressionism and Abstract Expressionism, taking lessons from one and passing on different lessons to the other. But he was also a bridge between European modernism and American painting at a time when so many of his generation had turned their backs on it. And I suggested by some of the contemporary artists whose work I included in this PowerPoint, to this day, he remains a bridge between American and European modern representational painting and contemporary artists striving to celebrate today's world. Ultimately, and as clearly seen in this exhibition, Avery has given us a wonderful body of work which continues to delight and inform our view of the natural world. Work which Rothko alluded to in his memorial address for Avery in 1965, when he concluded, "I rejoice for what he has left us. I think we can all join in Rothko's sentiment." Thank you.